Right. Okay. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Khaled Abou Fadl. He is an Islamic scholar and jurist. He is a distinguished professor in Islamic law at UCLA School of Law, where he teaches international human rights, Islamic jurisprudence, and other subjects. He has served on the board of directors of Human Rights, the US Commission for International Freedom. He is founder of the Usuli Institute, and you can watch some of their khutbahs and some of their lectures on his YouTube channel. And he's also a distinguished author. I have a pile of books right next to me. I started reading the works of Dr. Khaled in my late 20s. I was a young mother, and I felt that Muslim spaces and Muslim organizations would often have a real focus on form and ritual and not enough focus on ethics. And what Dr. Khaled talks about is, ihsan and beauty. And that is when I read my first book by him, which is this one. I thoroughly recommend these, Reasoning with God. And the next one that I read after that is The Search for Beauty, Conference of the Books. And there's one more that I've lent out and I don't have. And then there was a hiatus of a few years, and I started reading his books again. And they're really, really ringing very deeply at the moment in these contemporary crises that we seem to be going one from the other to. And I thoroughly do recommend these books. Here we are, The Palestine Sermons by Dr. Khaled. Really very moving and written many, many years in advance of what's going on right now. And a set called The Prophet's Pulpit. I have all three and I've read all three and I do thoroughly recommend them. So I think I've spoken for long enough. We have a Q&A function. Please do put your questions into the Q&A function. We have a decent amount of time after Dr. Khaled speaks for questions and answers. So please post them in the Q&A function. We'll be taking them. And without further ado, I hand over to Dr. Khaled.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Um, okay, well, I will keep my remarks brief, inshallah. And I want to, and then, inshallah, then handle questions. But I want to underscore perhaps what is obvious. Um, one of the very important questions in studying our history and thinking about the legacy that Muslims have had on this world and so on, to put it quite simply, is how did the impact of Islam come about? What were the constituent elements that created this dynamic energy, this dynamic force that brought a change to the world? Uh, and we one of the pitfalls of thought generally is the pitfall of familiarity, is that we often we will repeat um, our knowledge of events or incidents while forgetting to unpack them and to understand what did these events actually mean. What were they constituted of? What were the real life uh, structure of these events? So think of, and again, I this might, when you think about it, it might seem all too obvious. but they're important factors. Um, at the time that the prophecy of our Prophet Muhammad والسلام, uh, emerged on this world, onto this world, you had a reality, and the reality was that you had superpowers like the Byzantine Empire and the Sassanid, the Persian Empire. There had been a long history of challengers to these empires, um, that had systematically and consistently failed. These empires had created a level of dominance and supremacy on earth, um, and had overcome many challenges in the rather long and complicated history. The earliest Muslims and the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ, uh, what was what was it that energized um, the challenge to these empires posed by Muhammad and his followers? What we always come back to is belief. The pulsating heart of the very concept of an ummah is a people that believe in themselves. Without that critical element in believing that you can actually make a change, in the remarkable thing about history is that uh, you cannot meet a challenge, a historical challenge, unless this critical element of believing that you can actually meet it exists. That we call it iman, but what is iman? Iman is that to create to have an element of trust, so that you are not imprisoned by the vagaries of practical thinking. In other words, you dare to dream, you dare to have a vision, you dare to pursue this vision. And this is so important, particularly in our day and age. In a day and age where you notice, let me put it a bit differently. Colonized people are the issue of military colonization or military defeat is not nearly as decisive, not nearly as impactful as being intellectually colonized, being spiritually colonized. It is not the again, put in a different way, the battle of colonizing a people does not come to an end when you create a reality on the ground. It comes to an end when a people believe that the battle has come to an end. In other words, when a people achieve a level of defeat, they reach a point of defeat where they no longer challenge. We often have overlooked this, is that what made Muhammad and his party in general um, so potent is quite simply the system of belief that they have, the level of confidence that they had in what they believed in. And so much of the seerah of the Prophet والسلام, is that this absolute sense of confidence, an absolute sense of trust that they can generate, they can create God's promise to them. It is very much the very idea that we fully trust in what God has promised to us. And it is not just achievable, but we can envision it, we can see it. The whole, with the emergence of the whole Islamophobia industry, the whole point of the Islamophobia industry was to cut into the heart of this element of Muslims thinking of themselves as a people, as an ummah, um, a, 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 a people with shared destiny, with a shared set of causes, with a shared set of issues. To the defeat is in the emphasis of the differences between these people as more compelling and more significant than the similarities. Um, as I always say, awareness is the first step in anything, and being aware of what your system of belief is and what type of empowerment it lends you is so critical. The second point, since I want to keep my comments brief, the second point I want to emphasize is, and it is a bit of a subtle point, but nevertheless, it's, I think, a critical one. The goal, when you study the legacy of the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ and his companions and his family, um, we say that this seerah was about Tawheed, but we all know, as an article of faith, as an element of faith, that Allah gains nothing from what human beings believe or do not believe. In fact, as the Quran repeatedly emphasizes, that if people believe it is good for them, if they don't, then they suffer the consequences. Allah is enriched by none of it. What is the enlightenment and the light of Tawheed about? Well, I would submit that the enlightenment of Tawheed, the enlightenment of understanding that we are created beings entrusted with a legacy, that this entrustment, this entrusted legacy makes us agents on behalf of a principle. And the principle is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we are but agents acting on the behalf of that principle. The, the entire legacy of the life of the Prophet ﷺ and his supporters and his followers was, and the very idea of Tawheed is to give each their due. In a word, that magical concept that the Quran emphasizes, the word is qist. Qist is the essence, the heart of justice. Qist is fairness and equity in so it's a working system of belief that leads you to have a faith in equity and justice as practical objectives that you pursue and you dare dream of achieving in life. The subtle point that I hope to make is that at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, the exigencies of the situation of his own life, his own environment, the challenges that confronted him and his followers were those of people waging war against you, the people that surrounded the city state of Medina, were tribes that resorted to the sword to respond to you. And the critical thing is that although having that faith, having that belief, that faith and belief did not prevent the Prophet ﷺ and his followers from practical thinking instead of magical thinking. The pitfall that so many believers fall in is that the belief leads to magical thinking rather than practical thinking. Belief means that just because you have an aspiration often then leads to an inability to pursue this aspiration in practical means. Those practical means at the time of the Prophet ﷺ included responding by a resort to arms. And it was not just feasible, but completely rational. Why? Because the enemies resorted to certain kinds of arms, like the use of swords and spears and so on. And the logic of that age meant that a resort to um, to a response in kind was the most rational, reasonable thing. In other words, people who are coming to destroy you using the sword, well, a resort to the sword to respond to them was rational and reasonable at the time. I would submit to you that things in our age are quite different and have been so because of the civilizational deficit where non-Muslims have excelled in the field of arms so much so, and for many other different reasons. But a resort to arms in our day and age is a form of suicide, plus quite often a resort to arms means that you attack um, targets who are not at war with you, in other words, civilian objects, which is simply immoral and un-Islamic and unethical. In our day and age, in order to serve your system of belief in a practical and reasonable way, the challenge of our age is the challenge of the sources of knowledge and the construction of reality. In other words, that magical word epistemology, what we know and how we know it. And here is where British Muslims, like American Muslims, can play a very important role. In my 30 years as a teacher, I have, how do I put this? I am always impressed. You get a sense for different cultures and how the children raised in different cultures tend to react to the challenge of knowledge, the challenge of epistemology in our age. And after 30 years of this occupation, being a teacher, one of the things that I realize is, let me put it bluntly, uh, in my teaching, in my academic profession, I have always been impressed by Jewish students and how Jewish students pursue their work ethic. Muslims, if you want to serve your Islamic cause, one, work on your belief, work on believing what Islam promises you. Work on your vision of what a relationship with Allah means. Second, understand that the mission of Islam in this world is that critical core concept of qist, fairness, fairness to all, fairness in all situations. Third, is that the tools to serve that goal of qist, of absolute fairness, the essence of justice, the means to serve that goal is the war for knowledge in our day and age, for what people know and how people know it, and the instrumentalities of knowledge. And finally, the most important is your work ethic. It is not the real jihad in our day and age. The real jihad is precisely this, the work ethic that you have in pursuing and serving the system of belief that is Islam. It is not, in my belief, it is not any other form of struggle. Today, so many resources are dedicated to defining what people know and how they know it. And Muslims are, as a unit and as an ummah, as a collectivity, are still on the receiving end of this most important of battles in their day and age. Okay, let me stop there and see what questions have come up. But this is um, my journey with Islamic issues in my lifetime have culminated in these conclusions that perhaps are all too obvious, maybe, but at the same time so critical. Thank you.
Laura, are you coming on? Okay. Assalamu alaikum. Guys, can I
Sorry,
You
Khaled,
there?
I'm so sorry. It wasn't allowing me to unmute.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, if you could allow me that functionality, please, Zaina. Thank you. So sorry. I was trying to unmute. Thank you so much, Jazakallahu khair, for all of that, and really fascinating. So many important points, almost like a challenge that you've given to us, that you've handed to us, you know, this challenge to trust and to dare to dream, this challenge to be empowered by this light of Tawheed that you've spoken about and pursuing. So this active element of our knowledge being actively pursuing fairness and justice for all. I suppose that starts with ourselves, our families, our communities, nationally, internationally. And the importance of knowledge production. And there's so much that I'd like to unpick, because with knowledge production, there's this internal element of how knowledge is understood and promoted amongst Muslims in our masajid and in our Islamic societies, and sometimes how that can get a bit stilted, but also knowledge production in an era of Islamophobia and misunderstandings. So there's so much there to unpick. If I could ask one question, then Khaled, if I hand over to you to take one from the Q&A functions, if you wouldn't mind, Dr. Khaled, if you could just elucidate a bit more on what you were talking about colonization of the mind, sort of spiritually, emotionally, mentally, and taking away that daring to dream. If you could elaborate a bit further on that, please.
Yeah. First, before addressing this more directly, I want to just alert anyone that uh, at the at Usuli at the Usuli Institute in our own organization that we founded a few years ago, we've done a deep dive of the Quran. I've undertook a tafsir of the Quran. We covered the entire Quran in the past for about 3 years. We were studying the entire Quran from cover to cover. The other thing is that currently, right now, I am doing a seerah of the Prophet ﷺ. And I just want to cite these as practical examples of those who, if they want a, 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 a real life example of how you can approach the Quran and study the Quran, as well as study the Sirah, uh, inshallah, in what I in a way that is at least very sensitized to what decolonization of the intellect means. But the the other thing, more directly in response to what you've asked, um, in very concrete terms, uh, we Muslims, uh, when it comes to dealing with our tradition, dealing with our history. I mean, one, I just want to make very clear to the audience how important history is. I mean, it again, it's one of these things that you don't realize until you spend some time thinking about it. Everything, our whole system of knowledge is built upon what we know about the past. I mean, even think about your own individual life, who you are as a human being. It's built upon your knowledge of your awareness of the memories of your childhood, the memories of your adolescence, the memories of, and then your belief system about your parents, your family, your friend, your society, your profession. Uh, uh, This is history. So, and the same as you find with an individual, you find with a people, an entire ummah. The way this ummah, the way these people uh, perceive and understand and comprehend their past goes a very long way in defining who they are. I mean, think again. If you're an individual, well, how do you understand your past? Well, that past is history, and the that history is critical as to who you are, to the extent that if you have a person who has no memory of their past, they become very compromised in their consciousness in the lived moment. Okay, so then when you come and think about how do Muslims relate to their past? Well, we have a dichotomy that is ongoing and has been ongoing since our conscious, if you will, our conscious memories since colonialism, because that's really all we know about the world has gone through the filter of the colonial experience for the vast majority of Muslims in the world. How so? Well, if I ask any Muslim anything about the medieval era, the pre-modern era, the chances are they wouldn't know. They wouldn't know how people ate, or how people dressed, how people transported themselves, how people related to one another. Knowledge of the pre-modern is not attainable to us. For the most part, without a great deal of effort. What the average person knows, they really know from the the prism of what we refer to as modernity, which is more or less um, uh, when systems of communications have been invented that allow for the retention of a certain type of memory. And it just so happens, again, that these systems of communications were invented in the age of colonialism. So, okay, but there's a critical point here that the way we relate to the past, whether it is the more immediate past or the more distant past, among modern Muslims, have gone through two specific filters. One is the more directly what's often referred to as Orientalism or colonial scholarship. Let's use that term. Uh, how so? Well, all the even let me just give you a very simple example. Even something like how we care for Islamic manuscripts. Where these Islamic manuscripts? Why are Islamic manuscripts important? Because they are the repository of our knowledge of the past. Well, these manuscripts, we didn't have printing presses in the age of pre-modernity. We had the only form that literary knowledge was preserved, and that's manuscripts. Well, we live a reality that attests to the legacy of colonialism, is that there are thousands of Islamic manuscripts in non-Muslim lands. They are cared for by non-Muslim institutions. Indeed, Islamic manuscripts that are cared for by Muslim institutions in Muslim countries are in uh, not in the best of condition. Muslims don't do a very good job caring for the instrumentalities of knowledge about their own past. So we are all accustomed to the most prestigious type of historian on Islam is the historian that teaches at Oxford, at Cambridge, at whatever Western institution, not the historian in Islamabad or in Cairo. Or why? Because overall, there is a severe deterioration in the institutions of learning and knowledge in Muslim countries, whether it's Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Indonesia, Malaysia. There, in fact, these educational institutions are very much dependent on the Orientalist legacy. How so? Well, the most respected professors and academics in these institutions are the ones who go to the West and get their doctorates, are the ones who got their doctorate at Oxford or Cambridge or Harvard or Princeton. So, and think of, so that is one thing, is that the legacy of Orientalism that still has a chokehold over the production of knowledge of Islam and about Islam. The second major source of knowledge about Islam is apologetics. That Muslims, having confronted this severe imbalance in power about knowledge of their own history, knowledge of their own legacy, uh, have resorted to a very defensive posture where it becomes, I mean, I was just reading a book produced by a very well-known um, Egyptian scholar. I mean, half the book, it's about the Prophet ﷺ, and half the book is a response to Orientalists. And that's very typical of the situation or the condition that you find Islamic institutions are in. There's a near understandable, but I mean, at the same time, it has a very heavy cost to it that you are always in on a defensive posture where you are trying to respond to accusations. And what gets what gets ignored in this dynamic is a any serious engagement with your own intellectual legacy, with the own historical legacy that defines you as a people, because of the severe imbalances in power in the institutions of knowledge. Um, so there is, I'll make this final point, and then there is a further element that I think academicians would experience very directly, is that um, the greatest, the best intellects and the greatest talent find themselves tiring of Muslim apologetics, and they very quickly find themselves alienated within the institutions of Muslim culture in today's Islam. And quite often, there is quite a bit of an intellectual drain where our most gifted intellects um, find themselves having to go to non-Muslim institutions and apply their trade there, and eventually lose their connection to a the collectivity of Muslims in general, and even self-define themselves in largely uh, non-Islamic or un-Islamic uh, or agnostic ways. And this is where you find so many Muslim intellectuals, even when they're teaching at the highest institutions uh, in the world, at Harvard or at Oxford or whatnot, but you find them very disconnected from their Muslim Ummah. They're hardly a part of the Muslim Ummah anymore. and sometimes they even make it a point to send this type of signals that say, don't count us as part of the Muslim Ummah anymore. And this is I'll put it even more bluntly. I don't think we will emerge out of our plight as Muslims generally. And one of the legacies of colonialism is that we all grew up with the idea, or at least our parents, the original immigrants, grew up with the idea that the production of knowledge and the preservation of of knowledge is the job of the state. It's a job of the government. It's a Pakistani government that takes care of educational institutions, the Egyptian government, the Saudi government. This is a fallacy. Governments never relate to knowledge without hoping to control it and manipulate it. Throughout history, the institutions of knowledge that actually did any good were those funded by private institutions, not public institutions. And so as a result, while you see Jews, for instance, donating an enormous amount of money to support their own educational institutions and the autonomy of their educational institutions, Muslims don't. The reality is Muslims are actually the Muslim capital. I've spoken about this and written about it. Muslim capital is very cowardly and does not support institutions of real learning. They support things of form like masjids and things that it goes through the performance of Islamicity, outright performance, just to demonstrate an Islamicity. But they Muslim capital learns to be very distrustful of knowledge and distrustful of intellect and intellectuals. And this is a typical diagnostic or a symptomology, if you will, a symptomology of authoritarianism. Authoritarians, despotic cultures distrust the intellect and intellectuals. And because we all come from despotic cultures, colonized cultures, we look at intellectuals and we are scared of them, and we want to make sure we know what they're going to say before we support them. We want to make sure that they agree with us before we support them. And we are very distrustful of intellectual institutions unless they are going to tell us what we already know. They're for instance, they're going to repeat Bukhari. They're going to basically tell us what is already in Sahih Muslim. Don't give us anything that would surprise us. This is not the way institutions of knowledge work. This is not how knowledge works. And why knowledge is so important in our day and age is because it's critical for belief. If you have no knowledge, then what are you supposed to believe in? Then your belief is the result of magical thinking, not anything more substantive. It is the result of a wild imagination and a group of platitudes and uh, assumptions that can come apart very easily if challenged. Let me give you a very, very practical example, then I'll let you ask something else. Uh, uh, um, One of the things that has become for me just it's actually a source of trauma now for me is the number of messages I get all the time from Muslims that say something like, I am experiencing a real crisis of faith. Why do you have a crisis of faith? And then they'll usually tell me one of the tropes repeated by Islamophobia. The typical accusations by why hasn't Islam ended slavery? Why Aisha's age and the pedophilia and so something like that. And remarkably predictable. And I'm amazed that it's just the same questions, the same doubts, the same, as if it was so easy to come and to take apart that sense of trust and confidence in your own tradition. And with all uh, at least in the United States, the Islamic schools that exist, and yet none of these institutions are effective in responding to some of the most basic and superficial sources of doubt for Muslim youth. And that points to I mean, in comparison, there are things that when you consider something like the Jewish tradition, in terms of problematic issues, the Jewish tradition is 100 times uh, more challengeable than the Islamic tradition. But yet, how many times have you found Jewish youth struggling with their faith because of X or Y in their tradition? It's because their educational institutions have already dealt with these challenges and done so quite effectively for a very long time, while our institutions are very different.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Khaled. And talking about knowledge production, I know that on your website with Project Illumine, you have deep dives into each surah of the Quran, and you've started a Sirah series as well. I've been following those. I'm really excited for the rest to come out, and they're quite bite-sized. So I do encourage everyone to listen to those and look those up. Khaled, can we go to a question from the attendees, please?
Yeah, sure. So there's a few questions, and if we start with this one, what is the role of the Muslim community to produce new Muslim scholars who focus on studying what people know and how they know it so we can decolonize our knowledge?
Um, it's subhanallah. When I think of some of the talks I gave 20 years ago, and subhanallah, I have been uh, the very obvious point is that you cannot there can be no institutions of knowledge without material support. That's, I mean, the industry of knowledge is very expensive. It's very expensive because of the nature of scholarship. It is like scientific investigation in what Muslims perhaps are more familiar with in the fields of empirical knowledge. A researcher has to have the type of support to go down the wrong path 10 times before something works out. So, a great deal of resources are spent down wrong venues of research before you fall upon or you get upon something that actually leads to social sciences and the humanities, including even fields like theology. The most important thing for real intellectuals, one, is to avoid the ghettoization of knowledge. And what I mean by ghettoization of knowledge is that to uh, consider qualifications in through a prism of exceptionalism rather than peer generated qualifications. more specifically, it is easy to create institutions of knowledge if you define the qualifications for knowledge as so low as to be met in your ghetto-like institutions. That's a very serious problem, because what then it leads to is basically uh, uh, quote unquote scholars that would not be hired anywhere else, that would not meet the standards of rigorous scholarship anywhere else, are basically hireable by your institutions. And so you're not hiring, you don't have a competitive environment, and you're not hiring the cream of the crop. You're not hiring the Mozarts and the Beethovens and the of the world. You're actually hiring mediocrity, and then you are wasting a lot of resources on mediocrity. People who actually are not the most talented, not the most gifted, not the most do not do the most rigorous type of research. The second is that nothing kills intellectual research and scientific research generally, like uh, uh, the interference and the meddling, especially of non-specialists. And so there has to be, in all civilizations, including the Islamic one, uh, are a product of the human intellect and human imagination. If you do not generate space for critical thinking and originality in thinking, the whole project is doomed. So, put differently, there has to be the type of support to for the autonomy and freedom of thought, so that the researcher is not producing results that the wealthy doctor that funded him or her are looking for. But when you support institutions of knowledge, if these institutions produce if what the ultimate product, if you agree with 50% of what they produce, that's a very good batting average. In other words, you must be able to, the capital cannot control the instrumentalities and the conclusions of the systems of knowledge that we're talking about. So nothing. Let me close with this, because I just want I've been repeating this point for so long. The responsibility of knowledge, and remember that when you are talking about knowledge, you are talking about our systems of belief. You are talking about what we know about our history. Our history is critical in defining our identity. So you are talking about our own identity, our norms, our system of rights and wrongs, our system of ethics, what we are aware of, what we consider to be priorities in the world. You are talking about in all the quintessential elements that define us as a people. That's what is at stake when we talk about systems of knowledge. And this is too important to be left to authoritarian states. This is so critical that a community must take responsibility for itself. A people must realize that for the sake of our children, for the sake of our next generations, for the sake of our causes, we must fund these institutions. another element that that is very critical to add. Think of the histories of any people that come to mind. In today's world, when you come to the history of Hindu Indians, for instance, it is largely controlled by people who are Hindu. If you come to institutions of what we know about the history of the Jewish people, it is largely controlled by Jewish people. In fact, if you're not Jewish, it's very hard to get hired. I mean, it's not impossible, but if you're not Jewish, but at least uh, your Jewish colleagues must like you and approve of what you have to say about Jewish history and the Jewish people. Even if you're interested in Sikh history, today, at least in the United States, it is Sikh scholars that control that field of study. The only exception that I am aware of are Muslims. We are the only people that continue to our day, where you look at all the institutions of higher learning, whether, Oxford, Cambridge, University of London, Harvard, Princeton, whatever, and predominantly still it is non-Muslims. And the Muslims who you do find teaching at Harvard or at Princeton or at Oxford, and for the most part, there are some exceptions here and there, but for the most part, they've realized that they are so remote from their own people, their own communities. Their reality is so far and apart from the realities of their own community that they perform whiteness, if you will.
Yeah.
They perform whiteness to be accepted.
Thanks.
They're hardly Muslim anymore. I mean, Allahu Alam with their niyyah, with their intentions, but if they are Muslim, well, they keep it a very deeply held secret that no one notices. And that's a very, very serious problem. People, I think a lot of students, they're not aware that something like the genocide in Gaza, the genocide against the Uyghurs, the genocide against the Rohingyas, these genocides would not have been possible without the colonization of the fields of Islamic studies and studies about Muslims first.
Yeah. Thank you. So we've got about 10 minutes left. And so, Dr. Khaled, I'd like to combine a couple of questions from two budding academics, actually, if that's okay. So I'll read them both out, and maybe if you can address them both together, I'd be very grateful. The first one is, I've refused 2 PhD scholarships from universities here in the UK purely because I was conscious of the epistemic challenges that may affect the practice of what I know and how I implement knowledge into action. It's about belief. But I'm so distrustful of the institution of academia and regard it as a tool of colonialism. On the flip side, I'm not seen as a student of knowledge within Islamic institutions and don't qualify to belong there as a student. So that's the first one. And then the second one, who is a student at Oxford University, saying that I've just submitted my dissertation on contemporary scholarly views of the hijab, which include many of your insightful works. I am seeing an increasing amount of Muslim students pursuing Islamic studies at Western institutions. Here at Oxford, alhamdulillah, the faculties here engage in a far more nuanced discussion in comparison to the Orientalist legacies that they've had. But there is certainly no doubt that the Orientalist chokehold still remains. Do you have any advice for a budding academic who is trying to navigate these Western institutions as a Muslim, particularly in the field of Islamic studies, where knowledge production is largely detached from the faith and more critical than apologetic?
These are good questions. I mean, I feel bad for the first question. I don't know how the if it's different in the UK, but um, I had a scholarship when I went to graduate school. I went to my graduate school at Princeton. Um, and quite simply, I greatly benefited from the fact that you get funding, but there is no interfering in the subs in no substantive or no interference in the substantive production. So at no time in my experience did anyone come and say, do say X or say Y, otherwise you might lose your funding. So I completely understand where you're coming from, and I don't know the particulars of the funding that you've turned down. But one of the things that I greatly valued was the fact that uh, support didn't come with strings attached, and I so and especially this is something that again is very sensitive for me, and it really I say it was a great deal of chagrin and dismay is that um, if you if there are funding opportunities for budding Muslim academics from Muslim institutions that will create opportunities of funding without strings attached are not that common, and that's a real tragedy. Again, it's that phenomena of cowardly Muslim capital. I know a lot of wealthy Muslims who are just too cowardly to fund anything but just the masjid. Um, and the same habits and attitudes that they learned from authoritarian and despotic cultures uh, affect the way they think about capital and knowledge in everything in life. The other thing, um, I have there's a very good example of the type of institutions that Muslim funding can create. Um, in Britain, there is a very there's an institute that um, it's called the Ismaili Institute. Now, the Ismaili Institute is a fascinating illustrative example because this was created solely by Ismaili money, and this institute single-handedly has managed to create quite an amazing intellectual interest in the Ismaili tradition at a time when I think it's fair to say that Ismailis had been ejected to the margins of Islamic history and Islamic thought. They were before the Ismaili Institute. You would rarely find any serious scholar that would had any real interest or real engagement with Ismaili thought. And the way that this institute was funded and the way it was run and the way it was managed has created a renaissance in interest in the Ismaili contribution the intellectual contribution and the legacy of Ismaili thought and so on. And this is a very good example of how you can fund, create um, objective standards for scholarship, or as objective as you can get, respectable standards for scholarship, and make a real contribution that serves your own purpose without the type of authoritarian micromanagement that often leads to institutions losing respect or losing any sense of legitimacy or um, so this is in response to the second question. But in terms of advice, the best advice I can give you, because I feel for yes, I agree there are more and more Muslims entering the field of Islamic studies. Um, the Unfortunately, there are a lot of Muslims that still confront a lot of discrimination, a lot of bias and bigotry, where they find themselves locked out of um, institutions and opportunities denied to them just because they're Muslim, and so on and so forth. And I don't know, you know, at least in the United States, um, we seem to be taking a step forward and then a step backwards. It seemed like things were getting better for a while, and then with the rise of Islamophobia and the current crisis in with the Trump administration and the way that the Trump administration has tried to control academia, that has affected the access to Muslims. And because Muslims do not spend resources on their own institutions, and they don't create their own academic opportunities, and they don't fund their own institutions and systems of knowledge, um, that means that a lot of Muslims that enter academia end up being imams, or end up being uh, uh, playing a function that is not consistent with their qualifications. But anyway, the most sincere advice that I can give you is, as you enter this field, trust in Allah and do not lose yourself. Whatever you do, if the type of compromises that leads one to eventually, say things like, let me put it this way. I can't tell you the number of Muslims that I've known that have entered this field, and eventually, in order to make tenure and order to gain acceptability among colleagues, and in order to impress their peers, they perform non-Islamicity. In other words, they go out of their way to eventually, they don't remember who they are as individuals anymore. They're sort of hardly Muslim, and they don't really. They're so full of guilt and inconsistencies and contradictions, that they're truly become human beings that are deeply conflicted and deeply uh, at war with themselves. Hold on to whatever you do, persevere. This to me, entering this field and remaining true and remaining persevering in your iman and in your identity and in your Islamicity, and insisting upon it till the very end, is the highest form of jihad in my view, because it is very difficult. It is much easier to die for your cause than to persevere in your Islam as you go through the battles of knowledge, and especially when you know that you're going to say, if you speak the truth, if you speak what you honestly believe is the truth, that your non-Muslim peers are, for the most part, not going to like you and going to attack you for the most part, and your Muslim peers are going to ignore you. And that's what makes this life very difficult. When your brothers largely deal with you as if you're some type of enigma, and the others, the non-Muslims, are constantly don't consider you a scholar because you speak as an interested party, as if objectivity is possible in any type of science. But remember that if you constantly keep in your mind that the jihad of knowledge in our day and age is the highest form of jihad, I think inshallah, you'll be okay. And Allah will take care of you if you persevere. I truly believe that. Allah will honor you and will protect you. And I always tell my students, it doesn't matter that you are famous and praiseworthy in this earth, but in the heavens, that's where it matters. That you are a super scholar in the eyes of in the realm beyond the realm of our earthly life.
Thank you so much. Jazakallah khair for those really inspiring final words. Really appreciate your time and your reflections and almost your challenge to us today, Dr. Khaled. During the session, we're approaching Maghrib now, so some people have left, but we had 53 people online during the session. So alhamdulillah, thank you so much. So all that you've spoken about, the importance in these difficult times of holding on to our iman, this impetus for qist and fairness and justice for all, the critical importance of knowledge production and being the bearers of that, and the instigators of that, to lift us all and to lift our ummah and this ummatic conscience that you've talked about as well. Thank you so much. I think we could talk for hours and hours, but we do have an end of Maghrib. If everyone could please do look up the Usuli Institute online, you will find there, as I said, there's Jummah khutbahs and there's these wonderful courses that look into tafsir of the Quran and also the seerah of our Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It's new thinking, it's new angles and new reflections. So please do look that up. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Khaled. Thank you, Grace, so much for joining us and giving us so much of your time. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum.